My name is Stephen Deaton, and this is the Law of the Lord podcast, a production of the Newton Church of Christ in Newton, North Carolina. The aim of this podcast is to study God's Word for a deeper understanding and to see how it applies in our lives. Thank you for listening. We encourage you to search the Bible to see whether or not we are speaking the truth, because the Bible is the truth. It is the law of the Lord. In this episode, we study Genesis chapter 14, where Abraham rescued his nephew Lot. It tells of the first battle recorded in the Bible and gives the first mention of a priest of God. This seemingly random chapter actually is key to God's working out of the plan of salvation. Among other things, we will notice lessons on poor choices, redemption, and the surety of God's plan. But before we get into the study, please hit the subscribe button to be notified of new episodes. Now let's study the law of the Lord together. What would you list as some of Abraham's top events in his life? Some of the things that really stand out that are amazing about this man of faith? Would it be when God called him out of Ur the Chaldees that he responded to God's call to leave his home and to travel to a land that he didn't know about? He didn't know where he was going, didn't know what would end up happening. Would it be the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah as he stood there and he saw fire and brimstone come down from heaven and wipe those cities off the face of the earth? Maybe it's the birth of Isaac when he had waited so long to have an heir, had this great and deep desire, and finally the heir is born into his home. A great time of joy and celebration for Abraham and Sarah, and in the working of God's plan among man. Would it be the sacrifice of Isaac, where God commanded him to take that son, his beloved son, and to offer him as a burnt offering? No doubt any of these would be great things to look at in the life of Abraham. There are many events in his life that we can look at and see they are monumental in his life and service to God and the example that he set for you and I. It's monumental in the unfolding of the plan of salvation. But in Genesis chapter 14, there's a record of an event that might easily be overlooked if the only thing we had to go by was the Old Testament. It's a very interesting part of his life, a little snippet, a little snapshot, if you will. And when we look at it compared to these other things, we might at first view it as a minor event in his life. But within this unfolding in Genesis chapter 14 of the life of Abraham, the things that he experienced, the things that he did in his life, we have the first recorded battle, as there are many first, of course, in the book of Genesis, but we have the first recorded battle in the book of God. And we have the mention of the first priest of God, Melchizedek, which we'll talk about when we get down into the account more. And when you look at this and you look at it in light of what's revealed in the New Testament, Genesis chapter 14 is a deceptively significant part of the unfolding of the plan of salvation. It plays a giant role, if you will, in the book of God, in the Bible as a whole. And so it's very interesting to think about it from that perspective. So let's dive into the study now in Genesis chapter 14, beginning in verse 1, and look at the text and what it says about, first of all, this war of the 9 kings. And it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations, that they made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. All these joined together in the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. 12 years they served Chedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him came and attacked the Rephaim in Ashtoreth Karnaim, the Zuzim in Ham, the Emim in Sheva Kirithaim, and the Horites in their mountains of Seir, as far as El Paran, which is by the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and attacked all the country of the Amalekites and also the Amorites who dwelt in Hazon Tamar. And the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, the king of Bela, that is Zoar, went out and joined together in the valley of Siddim against Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of nations, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. And so I've dubbed this as the battle of the 9 kings, or the war of the 9 kings. Among the kings that are mentioned here, there are 4 powerful Mesopotamian rulers, Mesopotamia being over in the part of the Middle East that we associate with the Euphrates River, maybe the Tigris rivers. But this Amraphel that it mentions here, king of Shinar, was in southern Mesopotamia. The area of Shinar is there in southern Mesopotamia. We would consider that area to be Iraq today. Kedorlaomer, who is mentioned here as being a king of Elam, that area is in eastern Mesopotamia, and that would be modern Iran, western Iran, really. Arioch, king of Elasar, and Tidal, king of nations. We don't know exactly where those territories were in ancient times, but inasmuch as they are allied with Mesopotamian kings, you would assume they are from the area of Mesopotamia over there somewhere. But those are 4 kings from Mesopotamia, the area where Abraham and his family originated from. They go and make war against 5 kings in the Jordanian Valley, and these kings obviously are weaker kings. And the reason we say that they're weaker kings because the 4 kings subdued and subjected the 5 kings, so that the 5 kings in the Jordanian Valley had to pay tribute to them over a 12-year period, and we'll touch more on that in just a little bit. But these 5 Jordanian kings, you notice how it mentions their Sodom and Gomorrah. We're very familiar with them. It mentions Admah and Zeboim. Now, all of those cities were overthrown in the destruction of Sodom. If you look at Deuteronomy 29, verse 23, and you look at Genesis chapter 19, you understand that all those cities were eventually overthrown and wiped off the face of the earth. The other one there that's mentioned is Zoar. Now, Zoar was spared during the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah because that is the city where Lot and his 2 daughters who escaped Sodom ended up going. So Genesis chapter 19, verses 22 and 23 says, "Hurry, escape there, for I cannot do anything until you arrive there. Therefore the name of the city was called Zoar. The sun had risen upon the earth when Lot entered Zoar." So Zoar is a place where Lot escapes to and finds refuge during the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, as well as Admah and Zeboim. But those are the 5 kings, or the 5 cities who had kings in the southern Jordan Valley, the area of today what we see of the Dead Sea or the Salt Sea, as it's referred to here. The Valley of Siddim is also another reference to it here. But there's a war fought back in Genesis chapter 14 between all of these kings. And as we mentioned before, the 4 kings from Mesopotamia subdued the 5 kings of the Jordan Valley, and they made them pay tribute, and this lasted for 12 years. So since it lasted for 12 years, something interesting may jump out at you, or something interesting can be pointed out. In Genesis chapter 12, so a couple of chapters before this, Genesis chapter 12, it tells us in verse 4 that Abraham, or Abram, as he's known at this time, was 75 years old when he left Haran. Now, in Genesis 16, a couple chapters after where we're studying, Abraham was 86 when Ishmael was born. So 86 minus 75 is 11. So there's 11 years between Genesis 12, when Abram leaves Haran, and Genesis 16, when Abraham has Ishmael born to Hagar. So if there are 12 years of tribute that these kings have paid, in the 13th year they rebel, then the 14th year this war takes place, understand that the original war that began the time of tribute being paid occurred before Abraham left Haran. So just keep that tucked away for a little bit. Now, they rebelled in the 13th year. In other words, they stopped paying tribute. So the 4 kings of Mesopotamia came to bring them back under control and to exact retribution against them, to punish them for their rebellion. And that occurred in the 14th year. Now let's read what happened when they came to renew war with these kings in the Jordanian Valley. In Genesis 14, beginning in verse 10, now the valley of Siddim was full of asphalt pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled. Some fell there, and the remainder fled to the mountains. Then they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. Then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the terebinth trees of Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and they were allies with Abram. Now when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his 318 trained servants who were born in his own house, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. He divided his forces against them by night, and he and his servants attacked them and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. So he brought back all the goods, and also brought back his brother Lot and his goods, as well as the women and the people. So the war is renewed here, and it mentions the valley of Siddim. That's the area of the Dead Sea, and it says that there are asphalt pits there. Then it talks about how the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled. Then it says, fell there, and the remainder fled to the mountains. Evidently, what it's talking about is the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah got caught up in those asphalt pits, and their allies fled to the mountains. Then the very next thing it mentions is how the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah are sacked by these Mesopotamian kings. So evidently, kings of Sodom and Gomorrah are caught up in those asphalt pits. They're unable to defend their cities, to fight against the enemy. The enemy takes advantage of this situation and goes and sacks the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. They end up taking the people, the provisions, as well as, it says here, Lot and all that he had. Word of this comes to Abram, that interestingly describes him here as Abram the Hebrew in verse 13. Zondervan Pictorial Encyclopedia of the Bible says that word Hebrew literally means one from the other side. And the idea is he's one from the other side of the river, other side of the Euphrates River. So again, he's from the area, at least originally, where these 4 kings have left to come and attack the kings and the cities and the peoples in the southern Jordan Valley. So, it says Abraham gets news that Lot and all his people, all his goods are taken. So Abram gets his 318, in the New King James, it says trained servants who was born in his own house, and he goes and attacks Now that word there for trained in Genesis 14:14 is the idea of unsheathed. According to Robert Alter in his Genesis and Translation commentary, the underlying root word carries with it that meaning or that idea of being unsheathed. And it's implying trained fighters, that these were not simply men who knew how to be shepherds or how to plant crops and harvest crops or to build buildings, build homes, or whatever it may be. But these servants of Abram are trained in war fighting. Now, when you think about that, you might first ask, well, why does Abram need 318 trained soldiers? Well, if you recall back in Genesis chapter 13, it talks about Abram is very rich in gold and silver and livestock. And he and Lot had so much stuff, their households, their possessions, their flocks were so numerous that they ended up having to separate from one another. So Abram has, if you will, kind of a mini tribe here with him, all these servants, all these possessions. And so he needs somebody that's able to protect what he has. And they come in very handy here because he unsheathed the fighters, so to speak, to go to rescue Lot. Now, it says that these fighters were born in his house, and what that is helping us to understand is these men are not mercenaries. They're not just in it for the money, but they have an intense loyalty to Abraham, who has an intense loyalty, obviously, to Lot. So they're in it for reasons beyond material gain or other earthly motivations, if you will, base motivations, maybe we should say. They go and attack the enemy. They go north of Damascus, so that's over 300 miles away. They attack at night, and that means there's chaos and confusion, and they routed the enemies. Now, the way that Abraham and his allies are able to attack these four kings and win, in part, is because they do attack at night. But Hebrews 7, verse 1, describes this attack of Abraham and his men and his allies against these four kings as the slaughter of the kings. In other words, this wasn't a case of where they just ran in there, they scared them at night, gave them a fright, if you will, and the people just ran off and let Abraham snatch his people, or they snuck in and they snatched them away before there was any real fight that could be put up. When it describes them, or describes this event as a slaughter of the kings in Hebrews 7:1, that means it was a bloody battle and Abraham killed those men. Now, let's press on in Genesis 14, verse 17, where Abram is met by two kings when he returns from this slaughter of the kings. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Sheva, that is, the king's valley, after he has returned from the defeat of Kedorlaomer and the kings who were with him. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And he gave him a tithe of all. Now the king of Sodom said to Abram, Give me the persons and take the goods for yourself. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have raised my hand to the Lord God Most High, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will take nothing from a thread to a sandal strap, and that I will not take anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich, except only what the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men who went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, let them take their portion. So you have the king of Salem coming out to meet Abram along with the king of Sodom. We're going to deal with the king of Salem first, even though he's mentioned second as coming out. But this king of Salem, it says, brings out refreshments. It says bread and wine here. And it's to congratulate Abram on his victory. And when he met him and gave him the bread and wine, he pronounced a blessing on him. This priest of God Most High, the first one mentioned in the Bible, he declares to Abram that he is blessed, and blessed be Abram of God Most High, and blessed be God Most High. It's interesting, he keeps mentioning God Most High. That's the word El Elyon. There's a hymn in some of the hymnals that we use that has this, and it's referring to this El Elyon here, God Most High. And it means simply God above all gods, God over the universe, possessor of heaven and earth, as is mentioned here. And then after the blessing was given, Abram gave Melchizedek a tithe of the spoils that he took in this battle. Now, the king of Sodom has a different approach. The king of Sodom doesn't come to offer something, he comes to request or almost really demand something. There's kind of a sense of confrontation here. There's no gift that he brings, no praise that he gives, no thanks, no appreciation that's expressed to Abram for rescuing these possessions and these people. He simply says this, again, to remind ourselves, give me the persons and take the goods for yourself. Genesis 14:21. That's just very terse in the way that he approaches and speaks to Abram. A great contrast between that and the way the king of Salem spoke to him. So he says, give me the people but not the possessions. Well, really, according to the rules of war, Abram had a right to everything. He's the one that went out. He risked himself. He risked his people. So he had a right, really, to keep everything. But the king of Sodom's coming and saying, you keep the possessions, fine with that, but give me the people back. But Abram refused to keep anything personally for himself. And he makes note of the fact that he swore an oath to God and would depend on God. God was the source of his blessings, and any material things that he had was from God. He was not going to allow a situation where the king of Sodom could go around and say, well, really, Abram's rich because of me. Now, remember, the king of Sodom is a very wicked and immoral man. Back in Genesis chapter 13, verse 13, it talks about how that the city is known for being immoral. And Abram obviously doesn't want anything to do with that. He doesn't want his reputation sullied by the king of Sodom. So he tells him, you can have it all back. The only thing I want is that my allies who went with me, they get to keep their portion, and then what provisions my men have eaten. So whatever foods they've eaten, whatever they've consumed, whatever's been needed on the journey, well, that's going to be considered a part of just simply doing this deed for you, the cost of business, if you will. So that's where the account wraps up. Now, what are some things that we can learn out of this? Some of the things that we can learn out of this is poor choices. Lot was taken captive because he had made some poor choices in his life. In Genesis chapter 13, verse 12 again, remember that Abram's herdsmen and Lot's herdsmen had been disputing over water, and there's conflict and tensions rising. And it says in Genesis 13, verse 12, Abram dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. So Lot made a choice to go live near Sodom. Remember, he made that choice because as he looked out over the plain of Sodom, at one time, it was very plush, very fertile. So his idea evidently was, I can move my flocks down there. They're going to be well fed. I'm going to be wealthy and well taken care of because of all of that. In Genesis 14, verse 12, then, when these 4 Mesopotamian kings sweep through the southern Jordan Valley and they sack Sodom and Gomorrah, they're able to take Lot and his family and his possessions because he's living in Sodom. So he first of all moved near Sodom, and then he moved into Sodom. Those were poor choices that Lot made in his life, and he was caught up in the trouble that was brought upon these wicked people. There's a great lesson there how we need to be careful about the choices of where we are and who we are around, because the trouble that comes to them is likely to affect us. If we look at Proverbs chapter 22, Proverbs 22, verse 24 beginning, says, make no friendship with an angry man, and with a furious man do not go, lest you learn his ways and set a snare for your soul. So their very attitudes can rub off on us, and we can have trouble from that. Somebody gets angry and pops off, and you're with them, well, you may face those same consequences that they face. In Proverbs 23:19, he says, hear, my son, and be wise, and guide your heart in the way. Do not mix with winebibbers or with gluttonous eaters of meat, for the drunkard and the glutton will come to poverty, and drowsiness will clothe a man with rags. You don't want to be around people like that and pick up the habits they have, because it's detrimental to your well-being. In Proverbs 24, verse 21, my son, fear the Lord and the king. Do not associate with those given to change, for calamity will arise suddenly, and who knows the ruin those two can bring. So people who are unstable in their life, we've all known people like this. They just can't seem to keep things together in their life. There's one problem after another. They switch from one job to another, one relationship to another. They're up and down and all over the place. And the wise man says, stay away from somebody who's given to change. You want to be around people who are steady, reliable, consistent in their life, not those who are all over the place. Though there may be excitement and entertainment with those kinds of people, don't get around them, because there's calamity that will come, and you will be affected. Well, let's think about similarly in our lives, in our situation, and more to the point, Lot was taken captive because he had made some poor choices. We are taken captive because of our poor choices. We're taken captive by Satan. Remember Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. James talks about when we are tempted, we're drawn away by our desires. So we make a choice based on our desires, based on what we want, and we end up making poor choices. We end up committing sin. We end up getting taken captive by the devil. And so the Bible warns us that we need to keep the right company, in part to help us stay away from making bad decisions and bad choices and picking up bad habits, immorality, unrighteousness. 1 Corinthians 15:33, do not be deceived, evil company corrupts good habits. Proverbs 13:20, he who walks with wise men will be wise, but the companion of fools will be destroyed. So we want to be around wise people, people who are righteous, people who love God, people who honor God, people who have good, upright morals. And that's true when we're talking about companions and friends that we have in life. It can even be true of where we work, and we need to be careful about that kind of environment and influence that could impact us. But it's true also in entertainment or being on the internet. You know, there are things that are appropriate and good, and there are things that are not appropriate. There are things that would tend to lead us away from God, and we need to get away from those kinds of things. Those are poor choices that can lead us into captivity. So that's one lesson. Make the right choices, because poor choices will get us into trouble. Another lesson that we see here in Genesis 14 is redemption. You think about Abram's compassion on Lot. When they had the dispute among each other, Lot really should have gotten his shepherds under control. He should have deferred to Abraham and said, I'm sorry for the trouble that's been caused, and please just tell me what I need to do to make things right here. But Abram was the one who took action there and showed kindness toward Lot and told him, choose which way you want to go. Whichever way you go, I'll go the opposite way, so there's no tension and conflict between us. Well, when Lot made the choice to live near Sodom, then to live in Sodom, then he's taken captive. Abram, when he received that news, did not react in bitterness and contempt. He was not thinking, well, Lot just got what's coming to him, got what he deserved. He wasn't indifferent or callous in any way, but he had compassion, and he rounded up his men, and he took off, and he risked his life and the lives of his servants to bring Lot and his people and his goods and possessions back. God has compassion on us in spite of our poor choices, in spite of the fact that we deserve death, eternal death, as Romans chapter 1 talks about. The sins we commit are an abomination to God. They're an offense to Him, and we deserve to be punished with an everlasting punishment. But God is not bitter toward us, does not hold us in contempt. He is not indifferent to us. But as John 3:16 says, for God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whoever believes in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And so God cares about us in spite of the fact that we have created our own problem in giving in to Satan, making poor choices in our life, being taken captive. It's our fault. But God made provision, made plans, put forth effort and energy, and sent His Son to be a sacrifice for our souls so that we can be freed from that captivity, so we can be redeemed. You think about that statement in Luke 23, verse 34, when Jesus is on the cross, and as far as we know, this is the first spoken word from Jesus on the cross in Luke 23:34. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Of course, He has reference to the people who crucified Him there, to the people who mocked and ridiculed and called out for His death. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. The Lord wasn't bitter. He wasn't holding the people in contempt, but He was compassionate toward them because He wanted them to be redeemed. He wants you to be redeemed, and He wants me to be redeemed. That's a lesson we can learn out of Genesis chapter 14. Another lesson we can get is the surety of God's plan. Genesis chapter 14 is seemingly random and a record of ordinary events, seems to be incidental in the ancient world with no lasting geopolitical impact. There's no empire built or toppled. There's no economic or technological advancement. There's no religious awakening that spreads throughout the ancient world. But what we read about there is how Melchizedek came and met Abram. Now, Melchizedek only appeared in 3 verses. He's there and then he's gone. There's a brief mention of him 1,000 years later when David wrote Psalm 110. He mentions this Melchizedek, and it's like he pulls him randomly out of ancient history. It's so interesting. In Psalm 110, verse 4, it says, the Lord has sworn and will not relent. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. And then there's another 1,000 years of silence. Abram, or rather Melchizedek, is not mentioned again. But it's key to understanding God's plan of salvation. When you get to the book of Hebrews in chapter 5, Melchizedek is mentioned again. He's mentioned again at the end of chapter 6. And then in chapter 7, Hebrews 7, is where the Hebrew writer gets into greater detail explaining about the priesthood of Christ and relating it to the priesthood of Melchizedek. So let's read this here very briefly in Hebrews 7, beginning in verse 1. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all, first being translated king of righteousness, and then also king of Salem, meaning king of peace, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, remains a priest continually. Now consider how great this man was, to whom even the patriarch Abraham gave a tenth of the spoils. And indeed, those who are of the sons of Levi, who receive the priesthood, have a commandment to receive tithes from the people according to the law, that is, from their brethren, though they have come from the loins of Abraham. But he whose genealogy is not derived from them received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. Now beyond all contradiction, the lesser is blessed by the better. Here mortal men receive tithes, but there he receives them, of whom it is witnessed that he lives. Even Levi, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, so to speak, for he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. So there's an explanation about the priesthood of Christ and how it was represented in the priesthood of Melchizedek. Because the priesthood of Melchizedek is a seemingly everlasting priesthood. He's outside of the Levitical line of priests because they came much later. Remember that Levi was the son of Jacob, who was the son of Isaac, who was the son of Abraham. So many generations and hundreds of years later, this Levitical priesthood was established. But here's Melchizedek, who is superior to Abraham, as it mentions here, and therefore he's superior to Levi. And his priesthood is therefore superior to Levi's priesthood. And the Hebrew writer likens that Melchizedek priesthood to the priesthood of Christ, saying that Christ's priesthood is superior to the priesthood of Levi. And of course, in the book of Hebrews, what he's establishing is the fact that the Hebrew Christians should not turn back to the old law. It's no longer valid. He goes on to mention that in verses 14 to 17, saying, it's evident that our Lord arose from Judah, of which tribe Moses spoke nothing concerning priesthood, yet it is far more evident that in the likeness of Melchizedek there arises another priest who has come not according to the law of fleshly commandment, but according to the power of an endless life. There's a change of law that's taking place here. Verse 12 specifically mentions that. So he's explaining this, the reason Melchizedek is mentioned in the Old Testament and what it's representative of. He appears and he's gone. It's like he has no father or mother. There's no genealogy. There's no one before him. There's no one after him. And that's how it is with Christ. No one before him, no one after him. He is singular in his priesthood. As it appeared in the record that Abram, or rather Melchizedek, was priest of God Most High. In other words, Genesis chapter 14 and Psalm 110 are only understandable and derive their meaning from Hebrews chapter 7, as the Hebrew writer explains why Melchizedek is in the divine record. So think about this now. God's hand was guiding the events of the ancient world before Abram left Haran. He was guiding the events of kings and peoples, both great and small, and matters considered incidental and insignificant in history, things that were key to the redemption of mankind that unfolded over thousands of years. And if his hand is in that record where Melchizedek just shows up for 3 verses in Genesis 14, 1,000 years of silence, then Psalm 110, verse 4, and then another 1,000 years of silence, and then the meaning is seen in Jesus Christ and his priesthood, that assures us of God's will and of his word being fulfilled. Abraham stands as a giant in biblical history. He's key in the role of the redemption of mankind. His faith in God and his compassion for his fellow man is inspiring to us. The account of his rescue of Lot and meeting with Melchizedek are monumental in the Bible, and the same God, El Elyon, rules the world today. We can have full faith and confidence in him. We can go out and face the battles of our life as we seek to rescue others, to bring them to him and to bring them out of captivity. And we can always know and be assured that his working in his will be fulfilled. There need be no doubt of that. And so, as you reflect on that, will you not be wholly devoted and committed to him today? Thank you for listening to the Law of the Lord podcast, a work of the Newton Church of Christ in Newton, North Carolina. Find out more about us and access more study material on our website, lawoftheLord.com. That's lawoftheLord.com. Reach out to us with any questions or comments about this episode. We also welcome Bible questions that we can answer personally for you or address in a future episode. You can email those questions to contact@lawoftheLord.com. That's contact@lawoftheLord.com. We look forward to hearing from you.